morning, everyone. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to see so many of you here at the end of the semester. I know it's a very, very busy time of year for you, so we appreciate you carving out some time and coming to learn about teaching and learning and how to improve your classroom. My name is Dr. Christine Harrington. For those of you who are not familiar with who I am the Executive Director of the Center for Student Success at the New Jersey Council of County Colleges. And I am delighted to have the opportunity to really work with all 19 community colleges on improving our student success outcomes by using a guided pathways framework. And as you know, the guided pathways framework has 4 big umbrellas. And we put a little New Jersey twist on our model. So, first we want to make sure that we have clear paths for our students so that they can know how to get from point A to point B. Second, in New Jersey, we care about making sure that we have meaningful learning around that path. And that's where you as faculty come in as being key players to make sure that we have helped our students really develop the skills and knowledge that they need in their careers and in their future. And then, of course, the other part is the guided part of guided, which is helping students choose a pathway and stay on a pathway. So as you know, today our focus is on the teaching and learning element and creating significant, meaningful experiences for our students in our classrooms or in our virtual classrooms. So I am delighted to have a full agenda for you today. I want to just thank a couple of the folks who helped put today together. So I want to start off with the council staff, and my assistant director is kind of my amazing counterpart, Donna Rogowski. So please give Donna a round of applause. She's always there for us and does an amazing job at helping pull all these events together. We also have a couple of other folks from the council helping at our registration table, so I know they're out there, but hopefully they can hear me. Can you poke out there, Todd, and ask them to just poke their heads in real quick? We have Rose and Jess from the council who are assisting us, and we're very grateful for their support today. So please give them a quick round of applause if they're able to poke their heads in. Thanks, Jess. And thanks, Rose. I also would like to thank the Teaching and Learning Planning Committee. So in order to pull this event together, we had a committee that helped us craft what the topics of the day would be, reviewed the proposals that were submitted, and made determinations about those proposals. And I know not everyone is here yet. I did get a couple messages that some folks are running late, but I want to acknowledge all the players in that committee because that was really helpful. So we have Melanie Morris, we have Lalisa Williams, I didn't see Beth Ritter-Guth come in yet, David Bruno, and I know Lee Bella Castro is not able to come, but please give them a round of applause for the hard work that they have done to support this work as well. So you have the agenda in front of you. On the agenda is the Wi-Fi access if you need it, but I don't think you're going to be too plugged in. You're going to be really plugged into what you're going to hear today. So our morning session is going to be here, which is going to be with our keynote presenter, who I'll introduce in just a moment. Then we'll have lunch here as well. After lunch, we will be moving over to Craybiel Hall. It's just up the way, and it's a beautiful day out for a little bit of a walk. So all of the sessions will be over there. It is on a first-come, first-served basis. The rooms can hold, the technology session can only hold 30 folks. So, instead of having folks sign up ahead of time, we're just going to ask for everybody to be, flexible. And if you can't get into your first session, there's a great other option for you. There's 3 amazing sessions for you to go. And Rose and Jess will be over there to help guide you to get you to the right space. So there's 2 afternoon sessions, as you know. And we're really excited to have so many experts from across the state share their knowledge with you and for you to engage in some, incredible professional development today. So now I want to turn it over. I want to introduce our keynote presenter, Dr. Todd Zakrajsek. Todd and I go back a ways. He's actually a great colleague of mine. And for those of you who have not seen Todd speak before, you are in for a real treat. He is dynamic, he's energetic, and he's extremely knowledgeable about teaching and learning. You can see he's got a number of books out there. He and I actually co-authored one of them on dynamic lecturing. He leads the 5 Lilly conferences across the nation and has just been invited, I think, to almost every state. I think there's maybe 2 states he hasn't been in yet. He's really been almost everywhere and internationally as well. A couple of other key things that I wanted to point out to you about Todd is that he is so well respected and known in this field that the Gates Foundation has asked for his input, and he's actually going out there, I think next week, Todd, is that right? For a second trip to share his expertise with them, and also other national organizations as well. ACE and some others, and AQ, so there's several different folks that are really pulling on his expertise. But most importantly, you're in for a treat because he's fun and engaging, and I think you're going to have a blast this morning. So please join me in giving Todd a warm welcome. Thanks so much, Todd.
Thank you, Christine. I appreciate that. Oh, thank you very much. All right. Whew. Hour and 57 minutes left. We have an hour and 57 minutes, which for some of you probably feels like it's going to be a really, really long time. If I were very boring, you could get most of your inbox cleared out in that amount of time. But I'm going to do a different challenge. In an hour and 57 minutes, I want to see if there's any chance at all that we can rethink education. I want you to think differently about teaching and learning in an hour and 57 minutes from now than you do right now. And I'm going to do that by hitting a couple of concepts. I'm going to take that off there for just a second so you're listening to me and not reading any of that stuff. The concept is I want to take some common phrases that we have all heard and we commonly accept right now, and by the end of this, an hour 57 minutes, if somebody said one of those concepts to you, you would say, I think we should discuss that. So for example, have any of you heard, here's a earth-shattering, groundbreaking one, have you heard that active learning is more effective than lecturing? Anybody hear that, right? You've heard that? All right. By the time this hour and 57 minutes is done, I want you to look at somebody and say, I don't know what you mean when you say that. Or, I'd like to see some data. And what you're going to find out very shortly is that you can't do that. How about, you can't learn from one-way communication, passive reception of information. Can't learn from that, right? When an hour and 57 minutes from now, I want to have you be able to look at somebody and say, that is not true at all. And so several things like that are phrases that we've heard a lot that I think we need to challenge those phrases. So let's get to work. We don't have a whole lot of time here. How many of you love to play golf? Raise your hand. Should be about 4 people in a room this size. No, go ahead and put your hands up. I want to find the 4 of you. I think it's going to be 4. 1, 2, just 2, 3. I got 3. All right, I'll go with 3. I guessed 4. That's not bad, right? How many of you absolutely despise golf? Should be about 6. So where are the 6 people? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Not bad, right? Prediction's pretty good. How many of you are golf agnostic? Put your hands up. That should be most of you. And how many of you are amazed because you're married to someone who loves golf, and if you send that person to the grocery store for 4 items, they will come back with 6 things, of which only one of them was on your list. And yet, they'll go golf 18 holes and explain to you every stroke of 18 holes. I was in the trap and I took out the sand wedge and I hit the sand wedge and it came like 3 feet from the pin and I thought I could sink it, a little bit of a left break to it. And you say, all I wanted was like bagels and some butter and some gel, and you come back with nothing. So the point is people can do that. Now, I had to ask you that. Several times today I'm going to stop and do like a play within a play. You know what I'm going to do? Every time I do that, I'm going to wander over here, and I'm going to stand over in this spot. And this means I'm no longer over there on the stage, and I'm going to ask you what you just saw happening, and we're going to kind of play around with some of these concepts that we're going to be doing. So number 1, why would I have said, how many of you love golf? And I'm going to use golf as an example up here. Why would I have said, how many of you love golf should be about 4? So why would I do that? Let me know. You just raise your hand. And because of the way the microphone's done, if you say something, I got to repeat it real quickly, but we can do that easily. Yes? Yes. So if the student's not thrilled about the topic and only taking to complete a major, and you ask them something, they may not feel comfortable putting their hands in the air. And so I've said, okay, there should be 4. Where are the 4 of you? So I've done that. What else have I done here? What else? Yes? Yes. Right, I set up an expectation. It is an expectation that you raise your hands. And even kind of how many, and the how many does something that's kind of interesting. If very few of you actually are going to agree with a point, you usually would look around the room and say, nobody else is putting their hands up. How many of you took this course because it's a required course? And you look around and nobody else's hand's going up. I'm not putting my hand up. But if I say, how many of you are taking the course because it's required? There should be like 4 or 5 of you. I just want to know who you are. All of a sudden it's like, okay, well that's me. When I said, how many of you dislike golf? There should be about 4. There's a couple people that started to put their hand up like this and took it down. I said, there should be 4 or 5. Who are you? Oh, okay, that's me. How many of you hate golf? I shouldn't use the word hate. We should never hate anything. How many of you dislike golf so much that you'd be happy if it were gone forever? That is a different way of wording. So the point here is I did that so that I could get you involved right out of the gate. The other thing is, which is really important, I'm going to use an example about golf. If I didn't acknowledge to you, to the group, that I know that you don't love golf, you would tune me out for the entire example. You'd say, I don't like golf. And as soon as I explain the concept, you wouldn't listen, because all you'd be doing is saying, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like that. So instead, here's the deal. I'm going to use an example of golf. I do like golf. I have been golfing for lots of years. I quit about 10 years ago, and then one of my colleagues said, hey, do you want to go golfing? I went and dug my old golf clubs out. These are not it. They look way older than that. And I thought, yes, I want to go golfing. I'm going to try it again after 10 years, but I used to be a very serious golfer. I would golf with a handicap of around 9, which means if I went out on an average course with a professional golfer would beat me by maybe 10 or 12 strokes is all. Now that's pretty decent golfer. So what happens here, and the reason I'm using the example, as I got ready to go to the golf course, I suddenly realized this explains a really important component I have struggled with in my life. Here's the component. When you get ready to go golfing, how do you know which course to go to? There's something called a course rating and a course slope. Here's what the Golf Association has figured out, which is pretty amazing. If you take a professional golfer and have them go golfing, it doesn't matter if they go on an easier course or a more difficult course, their score tends to be about the same. And it's about the same because the way they play the game. They go down, they hit a shot down the middle, they hit it to the green, they putt, they move to the next hole. A good amateur plays the golf course differently. If the course becomes difficult, their score blows up. And so here's the gig. If your course is relatively easy, pros and amateurs, good amateurs, will golf about the same. And then, if I went golfing with a pro and said, oh, you only beat me by 10 strokes, that was pretty close, he might say, why don't you come to my course? And when we went to his course or her course, I wouldn't lose by 10, I'd lose by about 30. Because my score would blow up. So what happens here is the pro golfer's score is about the same. A good solid golfer, though, gets much, much worse on a difficult course than an easier course. And what the Golf Association has figured out is now I can look at a slope. I take 50 pro golfers, see what their score is. I take 50 good amateur golfers, see what their score is. And then I just plot a slope. The flatter the line, the easier the course. Isn't that cool? Because now, if it's a real easy course, we're going to be about the same. If it's a really difficult course, we're going to be very different. All you have to do is look at the slope. If slope is high, it's a tough course. Slope is flat, it's an easy course. Now take away the word golf. Here's the cool part. This is what suddenly was my big epiphany. If you take a really good student, it means it doesn't really matter how difficult the course is, they're going to do okay. If you take a good student but not a great student, it does make a difference. A harder course is going to wash out the students more than other courses. This suddenly took care of that one issue I've had for years. Some students do fine no matter what, other students don't. I used to just think of those as on the average for students. Now I segment the students out very quickly. The really good students don't need the extra tutoring. The really good students don't need the extra credit. You all know what happens, by the way. I offer extra credit. The very first people to get the extra credit are your best students because they know how to play the game. Go get the credit right away. The students who need the extra credit don't do it until the night before that's all due, and then they spend all night doing that instead of studying for the final. So I have to teach differently for these two groups. Now, here's the last piece. Easy courses versus difficult courses, yes. Calculus, organic chemistry is different from Introduction to Criminal Justice. I, by the way, am only a couple classes short. I started out, I'm a first-generation college student. I got so excited I didn't even say anything about myself. I'm a first-generation college student. When I went off to school, I wanted to be a state trooper. So I started taking criminal justice classes. Being a first-generation college student, I picked all my own classes. I did very, very well in high school. My very first, I had to have a math course, so I thought, ooh, calculus, I like calculus, I'm gonna take that. I took Intro to Criminal Justice, Intro CJ, of course, then calculus for my math class, and it said have to have a science course. I thought, ooh, I'll take physics. And it said, have to have a lab course. And I thought, well, physics has a lab, but they can't let you double dip. Why would they ask you to do science and a lab course unless you have to do I better take chemistry just to be sure. And then they said, have to have a social science course. And so I thought, ooh, I'm going to take psychology. So then I went and bought my books, cost like $100. Got my books, and it was like Intro to CJ, Calculus, Chemistry, Physics, and Psychology. And I thought, I am good to go. I was so excited. First test came back in chemistry was an F-. I went to the instructor and I said, I don't understand this F-. And he said, well, given you received an F-, it doesn't surprise me you failed to comprehend it. So I thought, ooh, that's what a mean teacher looks like. Then I took my Intro CJ class, a D-. Then I took my physics test, an F-. Actually, that was not really an F-. He put F on the paper, but it was 50%, so I figured that's an F-. And by the way, I wanted to switch into the other physics class because the other guy wasn't so mean. And they said, you can't switch from one class to the next. Because, of course, everybody would have switched over to that other class. And so in class, when the instructor said, so the average grade in here is 50%. That is unacceptable. 40 of you, you get a 50%. If you're not going to put work into this classroom, I don't even know why you bother coming. You should just drop and leave now. I said, put my hand up. I said, sir, I have a quick question for you. And he said, yes. I said, well, the average score was 50%? He said, yes, it's unacceptable. I said, well, 50% is like an F-, right? He said, yes. I said, well, I have a friend in the other class, and their average was like a 73%, so that's like a C-. He said, yeah, well, they obviously care more. I said, or is there any chance that that's a better teacher? I got to switch to the other class. So the deal is, when I got my F-, my D-, and my F-, I obviously was a good high school student, but I wasn't a good college student. Ever heard that before? Well, I was good before, but now I'm not. Now I'm realizing calculus and stuff is more difficult than intro psych was in many respects, but here's what's more important. Within calculus, within intro psych, within any discipline, there are difficult courses and easy courses. Come back to this in just a second. So here's our first task. I want you to just try this at your table real quickly. Imagine for a moment, I love to do things in reverse order, kind of flipping it around, because it's a different way of looking at the world. So here's what I'd like you to do at your table, and literally take like a minute to do this. So I'm going to watch the second hand. We're going to move fast on this. Imagine for a moment you wanted to keep the same course, whether it's criminal justice, it could be welding, it could be physics, it could be biology, it could be anything. Within that same course, how could you make the course more difficult without making it more rigorous, without making it better like outcomes? I don't want any better outcomes. I just want the course more difficult. Does that make sense to you? Not in the sense that we'd want this outright, but let's just think of how we could do that. So you're going to take 60 seconds at your table, talk it over. I want the course more difficult, but no better outcomes at all. All right, you got 60 seconds to go. More difficult. How would you do that? All right, we better stop there. All right, tell you what I'm going to do. Let's just find like 5 responses from different tables here. So what kinds of things could we do to get not better outcomes, but make a course more difficult? What do we got here? We need like 5 of these. We'll start over here. Yep, 1.
Require more memorization.
All right, so more memorization, but especially memorization for key concepts that we don't really have to have memorized. I do want to point out one thing real quickly. I'm not going to beat up on the concept of memorization because it's massively important. So here's the one thing I'd like to just keep in mind when people say things like, oh, I don't want my students to memorize things. I want them to think critically. Like, about what? And when my students say, why do I have to memorize this? I say, well, because memorization and use of it over and over again actually speeds the recall of information. I'll come right back to it in a second. And it does that. We did that with words. You've memorized a lot of words, right? Like the word college, you've memorized that. So I think memorization of key concepts is important, but memorization of ancillary things that aren't really necessary just because I think you should memorize these things, they were important to me. Yes, perfect one. Yeah, where are you in the back? There you go, talking off topic. If basically instead of teaching, what I'm doing is, I'm so bored with this material, let me tell you about my new lawnmower. And then I just do that. I'm making my course more difficult without making any better outcomes. Yes? Oh, good one. Let's take away resources. Ancillary resources that people want to go back and look at stuff. Let's remove those. So let's do things like, oh, I know, I'm going to put a book on reserve, but then kind of forget to do it. And then the students come to me and say, Dr. Z, you said there'd be a book on reserve. Oh, yeah, I am so sorry. I meant to do that on Friday, but I got so busy. I'll have it up there by Wednesday. Say, there's a test on Friday. Yeah, it'll be up there easily 2 days before the test. I, as a faculty member, by the way, most of the things I tell you like this, I have heard faculty say. All right, one over here, and then we'll come over here. Yes?
Don't provide feedback.
Oh, there we go. No good feedback. I know a student right now who is in a college, actually a university course, that thus far in the semester has received no grades on anything. We're on December 1st, people. 0 feedback on anything. And this individual is going to a top-ranked university in this country who's probably got a faculty member or a graduate student who's teaching the course who's just busy. So the concept is no feedback. Let's remove the feedback. Who needs it? All right, one last one. Well, make them work in groups, but not just work in groups. Doing what in groups? Is that going to make it worse, though? All right. So here's a quick one, is actually making people work in groups and then presenting out in front of peers. I'm going to put this in here as a kind of an odd little statement that will make the course more difficult with not better outcomes for some students. Here's one that I want to just point out, and I think it's really important. The way research is done in educational stuff is we collect data, because we all do this stuff. We collect the data and we report the mean. And when we say this is going to result in it, this moves test scores up by 3%. That's a half a standard deviation. I'm just going to tell you. It moves it up by a half a standard deviation. Just doing this one thing will increase your scores by a half a standard deviation. That sounds great, but keep in mind when the distribution goes like this, it doesn't move it a half a standard deviation for everybody. On average, it goes up a half a standard deviation, which means for some people, it might go up 2 standard deviations, and for some people, it might go down a standard deviation. So when we say this will change it, I'm so glad you said that, because it will help some students and potentially not others. Christine and I were having a chat on the way over. I got a young lady I was working with who's a college student, and she's got social anxiety. Worst thing in the world right out of the gate on the first day of class is say, turn to your neighbor and exchange information, because if you miss it to class, you can contact your colleagues and get information from them. Sounds pretty innocuous, right? This young lady was pretty smart. You know, she said to me, she says, hey, imagine you were giving me advice of going to the bar and just meeting people. What questions or what should I say to people? Should I walk up to a stranger and say, hey, by the way, why don't we exchange information so that I can contact you if I need you? And immediately my skin was crawling. It's like, no, we'd never do that. She says, oh, you know what's strange for a young lady in a college classroom? I don't know that person. And you just asked me to exchange information. Here's one I heard a faculty member literally does in the classroom. Communication class. We have communication with us all the time, and you can learn a lot from ancillary types of information for communication. I'd like you to stand up and turn to your neighbor and first introduce yourself very quickly. Do that. Stood up. Hi, I'm Todd. Hi, I'm Joe. It's nice to meet you. All right. Now, exchange wallets or purses or whatever you have. And now go through that person's wallet or purse and see what you can learn about them. That is an invasion of privacy on a massive level, and the class did it because the instructor said to do this. I've seen people who said, exchange cell phones with the person next to you. I will not do this and do not do this. I saw this at a conference. Person said, turn to your neighbor and hand them your cell phone. And the people went, okay, and turned and handed the cell phone. I turned to a woman sitting next to me. I said, hi, I'm Todd. She said, hi, I'm Joan. I said, hey, Joan, I am not giving you my cell phone. She said, thanks, Todd, I'm not giving you mine either. I said, great. Let's see how many of these suckers do it. And we watched around the room while a whole bunch of people exchanged cell phones. Talked to one person afterwards. He said, I was so scared to death during that exercise. You see, he was sitting next to his boss. He had just texted his wife, sitting next to the devil. This is going to be a long hour, which means you know what kind of relationship he had with his boss. For about a minute, he was waiting to see if she was going to text back, tell the devil I said go to. And while he was holding the phone, that could have cost a person their job. So when we ask students to do things, we have to be careful. So that's what I'm thinking through. We have to be very careful sharing information and everything else. So back to this. You've just taken a few minutes and looked at how to make the same course more difficult without adding any educational value. I'm arguing right now you could go in the other direction just as easily. But if I start to talk to faculty to say, how can you make your course easier without changing the actual rigor of the course at all, just make it an easier course, they'll say things like, oh, well, I guess I could require less chapters. I guess I could have less tests. I guess I could do less things. Immediately we'll come up with stuff to make the course less rigorous, less valuable. I say, no. You can't decrease the value of the course, you just make it easier. And when you talk to people, we can do this. You provide better resources. You do make sure that when you do group work that is organized well. I heard a group up here talking about asking questions that are inane questions. Ask good questions. Give students good feedback. Giving them feedback. So those are things we can do. So here's what I'm arguing. We can make our courses easier without dumbing them down. We make them easier by being better teachers and better educators overall. That's what we're going to do. Why? We do that because this study from Georgetown scared me. It's called the divided recovery. Everybody's talking about jobs these days as if jobs were never created until just recently. We've been talking about jobs. From 2010 to 2016, 11 million new jobs. Remember 2008 to 2010, how ugly that was? That was when the big global financial crash was happening. 2010, we started a recovery. It's called the divided recovery. That's what the report is called, because high school degree or less, those people occupied 80,000 out of 11 million jobs. Think about that for just a minute. 11 million jobs, 80,000 went to people with high school degrees. It's no longer viable to go get a job with no college education. You end up working for some box store at 29 hours a week because that's less than 3/4 time, means no benefits. But full-time jobs? Nope. There are very few out there. So when we start to lose this time of year, this semester that's happening right now, when a student is a first semester student, especially if they're the first the person in their family to go to college, and if they say, this isn't working out for me, I can't do this, and they walk away, not from your class, but from the school, they get to live here. This is an ugly place to live. If they just finish a semester, they at least get to move to here, some college. If they can just finish that associate degree, they get to move here, which encompasses this plus this. Now you're into the 7.7 million range. I don't mind living in the 7.7 million out of, 3.1 when they finish this one. They get up there fully. 3.1 million out of 11 million at least gives you a fighting chance. If they can go on, get this degree, now you're in the 7 million range. That's good. But it means we can't lose them. So how do we do that? We make our courses easier, because they're not all professional students. If they were, we'd be all set. I happen to work at UNC Chapel Hill right now in the School of Medicine. 7,000 applications for 180 slots. Think about that selection ratio for a second. 7,000 people want to come in, we take 180. A faculty member said to me, so how do I teach best? I said, well, here's one way of doing it. Krebs cycle, know it by Friday or you're out of here. Because when you have 180 slots out of 7,000 people, those are professional students. You would lose a couple, though. You'd lose a couple people who are struggling. So this is why we have to be really good teachers. Oh, by the way, for those of you who have students who say, I want to go to medical school, and if you give me a B, you ruin my chance to go to medical school. Number one, I don't give grades, right? I'm not going to give you a B. Number two, if you earn a B, it doesn't mean you don't go to medical school. If you need to use me as an example, use me as an example. Our GPA last year, I believe, I'd have to confirm this. You can confirm it real easily. It was like a 3.46, I think, GPA. We could get a 4.0 just like that. We don't want 4.0s. We want good students who can tell a story. And if that means you got a B, but you also build Habitat for Humanity houses, then you've got a good story. So the students who say, I have to have all A's, no you don't. And by the way, 3.46 average to get into med school, remember the distributions. If you got 3.46 as an average and you know you got 4.0s, you have to have 3.0s in there too. So it's possible with a 3.0, it's possible with a 2.95, it's not gonna be easy, but it's possible with a 3.0 you could go to medical school. if you've got a story and they believe that you can be successful. So huge, huge stuff going on here. Now, how are we going to do this? Whew. Lecturing's been around for about 1,000 years. This is not an original image, it's a reproduction. If you don't have ready availability to the internet and even books, it makes sense. You've got a person with some knowledge that talks to groups, and then they write it down, and then they can share it with other people. How many of you have seen this image before? Raise your hand if you've seen this image before. Only a couple. How many have not seen this image before? Raise your hand for not seeing it. Okay, good. You see what I just did there? I asked how many of you have seen this before, and a few hands went up. Then we would assume that the people who didn't raise their hand must be the people who haven't seen it. But then I asked you to raise your hand, which was weird. But the reason I did that's the way the room looked. Let's do it again, but please keep in mind how the room looks, and please do raise your hand the way you just did. Watch this. How many have seen the image before? Raise your hand. It's like how many of you didn't get through the material? Raise the hand yourself. But if I then switch it around, how many of you have not seen it? Raise your hand and look around. See the difference? What happens there when so many hands go up in the air, then you look around and say, wow, that's a lot. So many times when I'll say to my students, well, how many of you really believe in this? And like 30% of the hands will go up. And you look around and think, oh, that's a lot of people. How many of you don't believe it? And then 70% of the hands go up and say, wow, that's more. It's funny, when the hands go up, it kind of tips it. If 1/3 of you raise your hand for something, it would look like most people believe in that. And then you see on the other side of that. So the point is, I love to ask in both directions. Now, coming back to this thing. Here's the example that's used. It's not changed much. 1,000 years later, it looks the same as it did back then. You'll notice that you've got the people sitting up front who are all eager. You got your side talkers in the back corner. Oh, perfect. Look, see, this is great. Now, I'm sorry, that was just too good of an example. I appreciate you helping me. It was very helpful of you. You're a giver, that's what you are. And we have, of course, the sleepers on the side. Oh, none in here, but, you know, we do have that. And then it's weird, but you always get one person texting. Now, now this has been used for years to demonstrate why lectures don't work. They don't work because you've got your texters and you've got your sleepers and you've got your side talkers. But you know what they don't often talk about is this group. You still have engaged people. You have individuals who sit in there saying, I'm with you. Now what I want to do today, we don't have a whole lot of time, I want to rethink this. You see, Barr and Tagg back in 1998 said we should move from teaching to learning. Some of you have heard that. We should move from teaching to learning. If we move from teaching to learning, it means we should not focus on the faculty and how you teach. Today I must cover chapter 4. We should move to learning. Today, by the end of class, my students will better understand variability. So now we're moving from teaching to learning. When we say things like lecturing's not effective, lecturing is not as good as active learning, we're talking about teaching again. We should be talking about learning, which is what I'm going to do. So I'm done hating on the lecture. I'm just done with it. If any of you can please forward to me one study that says you cannot learn from lecture. In all of education research that's out there, I would love to read it. It cannot be a study that shows that the jigsaw method is better than a traditional lecture. That's a different statement. I'm talking about a statement that says you can't learn from lecture. If we can't learn from lecture, by the way, it really changes our whole life. Oh, by the way, I did write this book with Christine on dynamic lecturing. And I don't know if I told Christine this yet. My daughter come home for Christmas. She's like 30 years old, and she picked up the book off my desk. She says, oh, Daddy, you wrote a parenting book. Dynamic lecturing. She said, you lectured me my whole life. So the concept is we lecture all the time, and so there must be some value to it. So let's figure out where the value might lie. This thing, I do have to ask, because not many people have seen this. How many have seen this graph before? Anybody in here? This is a really not very often seen graph. Okay, good. So couple people. Richard Hake, in his physics class, gave a pre-test at the beginning of the semester and a post-test. The post-test basically minus the pre-test gives you how much the gain is. This is not individual students. These are entire classes, averages for classes, which means 6,000 data points in here. This data point is a course. This is a course. He did this with high school, college, and university. In the study, it says interactive engagement are courses in which the students participate in the class. I have already asked you to make a course more difficult. I've asked you to raise your hands on how many have seen things. This would be interactive engagement. Pure lecture, traditional. Traditional is I come in here. I almost did this too because I really like Christine. I like messing with her. I almost said, thank you so much for inviting me. Today we're going to talk about teaching and learning, and we're going to identify several components of teaching and learning that lead to better outcomes for students. One of the things we want to keep in mind is that if I keep talking like this is that you will fall asleep very quickly. You'll do that because we've removed variability from the room. I'm not wandering around so much and actually keeping my voice very modulated. Although, please do notice, it is much easier to understand my words right now, isn't it? Which reminds me I have to be a little bit more careful when I'm talking and running around because I keep my voice down and I keep it calm and you can hear me better. It's almost soothing. And I could slow down a little bit more because some people say I talk too fast. So now, let's talk about this graph. The traditional classroom is more like this. And if you have questions, you would come and see me on my office hours. That's what this thing does. Now, here's the cool part. Do the pre-test, post-test. The higher up, the more learning there was, the bigger delta. This is all normalized scores here. So if the whole class scored an 80 on the pre-test and 100 on the post-test, it'd be a 20-point gain. This line represents the highest you could get to relative to where you started. Here's what's cool. Notice all of the lecture is down here. There's not a single lecture up in here, even spotted around up in there. It's not there. There's also the worst interactive classrooms are down here right in the middle of lectures. So the message that Christine wants me to share with you is that if you are a phenomenally good lecturer, you should stop and do crappy group work and break even. No, that's not the message. Here's the deal. The worst you could do with interactive is about where lectures are. This has nothing to do with strategies of teaching, though. I believe this is all about learning, and I'll tell you why in just a second. The reason I wanted to take a second with this has been misinterpreted for 20 years, and I'm tired of it. 20 years people have said, look, you should do interactive learning, you should not do lecturing. Let's rephrase this just a little bit. Imagine this was a graph that demonstrated, instead of interactive engagement, put in exercise with proper nutrition. Exercise and good nutrition goes in those green boxes. Exercise alone goes in the red boxes. You see, we would say, if you exercise, you get these kind of health gains. If you exercise and add good nutrition, you get these gains. We should stop exercising and eat well. Would make no sense at all. But what this says here is interactive engagement is doing like I've been doing, lecturing with engagement, and the red is all lecturing. What this actually does say is we should stop lecturing all the time and mix things up. The reason I say it's been misinterpreted, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard people say, this is evidence that lecturing is bad. It's not. It's evidence that you should put something with it. So I don't believe in the stop lecturing, do active learning. I believe in the yes and. Lecturing is good, and here's how you make it way better. And I'll show you why in just a second. Oh, Scott Freeman. Scott Freeman is actually the one person I'm going to meet with the Gates Foundation. I met him once before. Gates Foundation asked me to come and do a presentation about what I'm sharing with you today. And I told them, Scott Freeman right now, Scott Freeman, this article has been downloaded 200,000 times. If you write an article that gets downloaded almost 250,000 times, it's having an impact. What this article basically says is a meta-analysis of the effect of active learning in the classroom. And the study is so clear. If you lecture all the time, a traditional continuous expository delivery of information, outcomes go down. If, however, you use other techniques to put with the lecture, Socratic methods, storytelling methods, lecture discussions, then it goes up. And so the point here is lecturing all the time is bad, lecturing with other stuff is good. Then people write stuff like this. This is a really important article. The impression I get is it's almost unethical to be lecturing if you have this data. Now, Eric Mazur has done some phenomenal stuff, but Eric Mazur does lecture too. He does mini lectures. I love his method. He lectures for 15 minutes. You have a multiple choice question. As a group, I would say, how many of you think it's A, how many B, how many C, how many D? I can immediately see who got it right and wrong as a group. If about 75% of you get it right, 25, 30% get it wrong, I say turn to your neighbor and convince your neighbor of your answer. If it's like 25% get it right, then I'm going to teach the material again. There's no reason to turn to your neighbor if most of you get it wrong. If all of you get it right, I say good for you and we move on. I get some data from it, but most times it hangs in that 60, 70%. Turn to your neighbor, figure it out. And so the point here is Eric Mazur, I know the guy. Eric doesn't mean lecturing is unethical. He means continuous expository delivery of information is unethical, although that doesn't flow well. So the concept now is that phrases come out like that and then people think, oh, we shouldn't be lecturing. Like this. This is August of 17. The Vermont Medical School had said, we are lecturing, because lecturing doesn't allow for learning of information, we are going to take it out of the curriculum. It's going to be gone. The article actually goes on, by 2019, there will be no lectures. By 2024, if a physician talks to you and says, oh, I'm from the Vermont Medical School, please find a different doctor. Because, and I'm stating that pretty emphatically, I'm expecting them to call me someday. The reason I say that, and I shouldn't say that, if they graduated, they must be a good doctor. I'm waiting to see what their outcomes look like, because when you take away all lectures, you have to have a non-lecture situation is really difficult for me. Oh, welcome to chemistry lab. Today in chemistry, oops, I can't lecture. Hey everybody, welcome to chemistry lab. The stations are set up, go at it. Oh, and by the way, if you put two chemicals together out of order, they will blow up. Oop, I can't lecture. Just work together, but stay back. If I just spend 5 minutes, hey everybody, today what we're going to do is something about bases, and we're going to learn a little bit more about a base, and by doing this, we're also going to be able to do these things. I'm going to frame it. I'm going to tell you why we're doing it. I'm going to give you some context. I'm going to tell you some things to be careful of. Don't let this get on your skin. I know it says on there, don't let it get on your skin. That's not just like the warning that you get when somebody puts down a dish that's hot. It will burn your skin off, so be careful. All right, are there any questions? I've just done a 3-minute mini lecture. So these little types of things are fine. So the point is we have to be careful what this means. So this doesn't mean don't lecture, it means mix it with other things. And this is why I wanted to point out, this is that book that Christine and I wrote, Dynamic Lecturing. Publisher didn't want to publish this book, by the way, because he said nobody wants to hear about lectures these days, it's active learning. 1,000 copies were sold before the book came out, pre-sale. So it's still a big topic. But the reason I wanted to show you this is the other book I wrote with Claire and Michael, 101 Intentionally Designed Activities. This is a book that's all about activities. This is a book that's all about lecturing and adding things to lecture. I pointed this out because I'm not telling you should all go out and lecture. Please, just listen to me. If you're texting your friends or shopping or anything, stop for a minute. Do not leave this room thinking my message is that it's okay to be lecturing all the time. I didn't say that at all. The message is it's okay to lecture sometimes as long as you know the lecturing is resulting in learning. We'll get to that part. The other thing we need to get rid of, and this is the other one, I told you an hour and 57 minutes. When somebody says to you, lecturing is not effective, try this. Say, what kind? I love doing this to people. Lecturing is not any, I know what you're saying, Todd, but lecturing is just not, I don't like, oh, here's my favorite. I can't learn from the lecture. Say, oh, which kind? And I say, well, lecture. When we think of the lecture, what do we think of in terms of lecturing? So think for just a second. If I just say, I have a friend who lectures all the time. I just have a friend who lectures. I have a friend who lectures. So what are like 5 characteristics that are this common things we think about? What would you think about? My friend lectures, what does that mean? Yes? One-way communication. Back here. One-way and passive learning. People just sit back and just, yes? Okay, excellent. I'm telling, I'm not selling. Good. Boring, usually boring, right? Monotone often comes in. It's just boring and monotone. All right, other things? front of the room, one-sided. Any idea what age it might be? I just say it's my friend. How old is this person? Older, usually a little older, right? We'll have that stereotype comes in. Oftentimes what we have, oh, I bumped a thing here. We'll have a situation where we will say a lecture, but there's tons of different types of lectures. Formal, Socratic, semi-formal, lecture, discussion, expository, story time. These are all, there's like 12 different types of lectures. There's different types. There's not a lecture. And when it comes to active learning, lecturing is more effective than active learning. Active learning, these are individually designed educational activities. There's tons of them out there, but there's the Find the Flaw, Think, Pair, Share, Jigsaw, Wrappers, Peer Instruction. That other book has 100 of these. I know there's a couple of hundred of things. So when somebody says active learning is more effective than lecturing, now what I'm coming back to is which kind of active learning is better than which kind of lecturing for which type of students and in which situation, right? If somebody tells me active learning is better than lecturing, it's like saying, if I told you right now, do you know Chinese food is more nutritious than American food? Very few people would say, oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I know that too, because you know what? People in America eat like McDonald's, Ruby Tuesdays. They eat stuff like that. It's so bad. You go over to China and they've got like really good nutrition. I went over there once and had one of the best meals of my life. Yeah, Chinese food's way better than American food. That would just, we would all sit back and say, don't we talk about which kind of food? So the point here is we have to be careful with that phrase. So there's one we're going to just get rid of, that whole concept of that. Before I even move on, I'm going to try not to here. I made a mistake with this. Okay, good. Think for just a second, back to lecturing. So we have to be careful not to lecture too long. What does the research say? What's the average amount of time before a person gets bored in a lecture for students? 7 minutes? 5, 7? Where's the optimist in the crew? 20, I heard 20. Who had 20? Who said 20? I like that. Oh, well done, thank you. 10 minutes is good. Where's the pessimist in the group? All right. 2 minutes, you're not a pessimist. That's still moderate optimism. I've heard 30 seconds, good for you. I heard negative 30 seconds once. Minus 30 seconds is, hey, what class you going to? I'm going to Dr. Z. It's that's the lecture class. I'm already bored. So it could be like minutes beforehand. So we'll say this all the time. Here's a quick question I love to ask people. The average student picks up a book, a 19-year-old picks up a book, not whether they will read or not. They start to read. They've gone through a couple sentences. How long before the average student gets bored reading? Right? What do they? I heard a 1 paragraph and a half, then what do they read? Why would we care what they're reading? Oh, because what would matter on the reading? What would make differences if you're reading? The narrative, whether they're interested, is the person speaking at a level they understand? You know, I've asked this question for hundreds of places, and every time I do it, numbers always come out for lecture. And when I ask about the book, invariably 2 or 3 people will shout out either numbers or paragraphs or something, and always within 2 or 3 people, someone says, wait a minute, what are they reading? What's the difference? Why is it that the lecture would always lead you to say numbers, and the text, books, would normally make you say it depends? Wouldn't those same things depend on the lecture? There's a different framework. So I'm just going to leave that floating out there to think, why the difference for lectures versus books? It's the same thing. And how long is it? What does the research say? Let me set my timer here. Watch this. All right, let's pretend like we're in class. Ooh, welcome to Introductory Psychology. Today we're going to talk about classical conditioning. So classically conditioned responses. Let's do this quickly in terms of, I know most of you have done the reading. If you have an unconditioned stimulus and unconditioned response, that's a naturally occurring phenomena. And if you take the unconditioned stimulus and you pair it with a neutral stimulus, that neutral stimulus will come to elicit a response that's similar to but not identical to the unconditioned response. And this is, well, you're laughing about stuff now. Are you already bored? That's pretty good because you made it 29 seconds. How long before the average student gets bored? That's 29 seconds. You want to know how you're selling a house. What do you do when you sell a house? You're going to sell a house. Open house. This is better. I'm going to have an open house. What should I do during my open house to help sell my house? Oh, I'm baking cookies. Why would I bake cookies? The smell. If you grew up in a nice, loving household, which this is an important consideration, if you did, and your parents or grandparents made cookies, And then you used to smell the cookie and say, oh, I love cookies. Oh, I love grandma. This is so nice. Later in life, you walk down the street and you smell cookies and you think, oh, I don't know why, but I feel great right now. You can be stressed and walk into the house and smell home-baked bread, and it's like, wow. That is a classically conditioned response. Unconditioned stimulus and response, being in a loving environment and feeling relaxed. That happens naturally. You pair the loving environment with the smell of cookies will come to elicit a relaxation because it was paired with that loving environment. Some people get all stressed when they smell Bengay. Same responses. Now, I could have you turn to your neighbor and figure that out, but I can tell you that example I just did was more than 29 seconds, and very few of you got bored during that example, but many of you got bored during the first one. It depends what type of lecture, how it's delivered, and to whom. When somebody says students get bored after, now try this again. How long before the average student gets bored in a classroom? Think to yourself, how would I operationally define those variables and test that? I have found studies on mind wandering. I have found studies on, actually mind wandering is the big one. One person actually did heart rates. Heart rates drop after like 10 minutes in a classroom. It kind of makes sense if you run into a classroom with a backpack that your heart rate's going to go down. Have you ever you've been relaxed and interested in a topic? Probably. So heart rates probably don't work. I don't know how to test that hypothesis. And the number of minutes, I don't even know how to do that. Self-report's terrible. The point is, it's a hard thing to even collect. It's a hard thing to collect, and it would depend on the classroom. I don't know the study out there. I've looked for 10 years for a study that says after X amount of minutes, students get bored with a research methodological design that I approve of. So the point is, I don't know. So we're not sure about that. There's another one for our minute, hour and 50 minutes. So let's go with one type. Let's just break this down quickly. One type of lecture is the storytelling lecture. You want to tell me that people can't learn from stories? We could have that discussion too. Storytelling is ineffective. Somebody like Garrison Keillor stands up and tells you a story, or somebody else tells you a story, and we find out, oh, I didn't learn anything from that. We often express through stories. So here's your challenge. The storytelling method, I'm going to give you like another minute because I've been talking too much now. For whom would this method work well? Who in the educational system would really benefit from the storytelling method, and who would not benefit from the storytelling method? Okay? So I'm going to give you, and again, let's take 90 seconds here. This is going to be a little bit trickier. I'm watching the clock here. 90 seconds, talk at your table. For this storytelling method, who does it benefit? Who does it not benefit? Go. All right, let's see what you came up with. Okay. So let's try the for whom it works well first. Actually, the only reason I did this whole exercise is I got to use the word whom. So that's all. That's it. So for whom does this work well? Yes?
What I lecture, I like to do the storytelling because I teach nursing,
Mm-hmm.
and I relate the storytelling with clinical experience so that they can have I feel that they have a vivid, some type of visual.
Yes.
stuff.
So that's why the method works well, but for whom does it work
I
well?
think that maybe high school level that does not share that idea.
So what I'm hearing from you is maybe when you say a high school group that maybe doesn't share the ideas, it's maybe a group that needs to be motivated. You need to show them the value of it. So there's one, perfect. It works well for a group that maybe doesn't come through the door highly motivated, because this can help show them why it's important. What I'm trying to shift for, and you can see right now, is instead of just saying the storytelling method is good or bad, it's good for whom. So it's good for people that you need to motivate a little bit. Who else would it be good for? Yes? Perfect. And I have to keep repeating these because of the microphone and stuff too, but anyone who would identify with the characters. If you can identify with the story. I have this neighbor. Might not be any different from your neighbor. And for my neighbor, I've already done a huge assumption, right? I have an assumption that you all have had neighbors. And first of all, somebody might say, well, wait a minute. If I tell you, my house sits in a little cul-de-sac, you say, oh, I've lived in apartments my whole life. You're not going to identify with that story. If you come from a whole different culture, where houses look different or neighbors are different, it's not going to make sense. So it works really well when the person can identify with your story. But let's keep in mind that we don't get to teach in a homogeneous environment, which means sometimes my stories, well, that's the next part. When you can identify well, that's a good one. What else do we have? Just a couple more. Who else does this work well for? Yes? All right, so if they're uninformed about the topic. If they're uninformed about the topic, it puts some context for them, right? So it gives them context. If they're uninformed, it says, here's a context, a way to build around it. Yes? A couple more? Yes? It does or does not? I'm going to tell you I believe it does not. But okay, go ahead.
I think that there's different types of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
There's different ways to storytell.
Yes.
And I think at the beginning you started with a story about golf. And
Yeah.
then now we understand the differences between courses. Like
Yes. Yep.
So I think it can work. It just depends on the delivery of how you say it.
So you actually, is it Melissa? Melissa. So Melissa says that she thinks it works well for everyone. One thing you did say, which I really, really do like, is there's also a way to fragment this out. There's different types of storytelling method. So if I use a narrative storytelling method, it's different from a different type. But what I'm going to say is I think I agree with you that it does what you said, but if you came from a culture where you never saw anything related to golf in your life, you don't even know what the word golf means, then I think that may not be really effective. Now, if I build it out enough and I can hold you in there long enough to get it, but I got that one because I had a friend of mine once who taught in Uganda, and he'd used an example. He said, it was a physics class, and things roll down a hill. It's much like a skier coming down the hill. And the student says, we don't know what do you mean a skier coming down a hill? Oh, well, when I was young, I used to go skiing. That story wouldn't matter. Right, if your story is relevant to the person. But that's why I'm saying this, and I think this is important. If my story is not relevant to you, then it's not going to be effective. So it does have to have some relevancy. So there we go. But that means it's not going to work for everybody. It's going to work when there's relevancy. So that's what I'm after, the type of learner where they have some relevancy we're going, so that's good. And we've also broken down different types of stories, which is good. One more person that may not work for? Anybody else? It may not work well. Yes? Yeah, but why would it not work for engineering? Okay. All right, so this is a good point, and I'm going to repeat again for this. For an engineering student, because you have to have very pragmatic, you may have to have certain components to it. I'm going to keep trying to dig down to like the educational component that underlies the things we're saying. So on this one, what I would actually say is, if there's certain specific information you need, and the story actually is embellishing using information you don't need, it actually could make it harder. And when Christine and I are working on the book, we found research out there. If a student is struggling, barely hanging in there, and you tell a story that's ancillary to the main point, it actually makes it harder for the student. Because the student now has to figure out how to take that story and build it into the context. And so what happens here is if you're an expert and you see all these great ways of tying it in, but the student doesn't, and only when they're right at the edge of what they can handle, the extra information bogs them down. Have you ever had a student say, excuse me, is this going to be on the test? Part of what is this going to be on the test comes from is, I am right now hanging on by my fingernails and I don't know what I should really attend to. Is this something I should attend to? Or are you telling me this story because you think it's funny? And there's actually research out there now showing that if I use a joke to illustrate a point, and you're barely hanging in there, the joke may make it worse for you. Because now you're trying to figure out, why did he tell that joke? Have you ever had to explain a joke to somebody? If you've ever explained a joke to somebody, that's that thing they didn't catch, that implicit connection that they should have gotten, which means they didn't cognitively follow you. So when things are very, very cognitively complex, sometimes the storytelling method makes it better, sometimes it can make it worse. So yes, sir, and then we'll move on. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. No, a story like telling, I mean, it's what you, no, right. Well, for instance, let's see, that's a good story we can do. Oh! This has been a long time since I've done this. Gestalt psychologists. Who is the psychologist that studied at Tenerife? Was it Kohler, Kafka, or Wertheimer? It was either Kafka or Kohler, I'm pretty sure. Anybody know? Let's go with Kohler. So Kohler, the Gestalt psychologist, suddenly during World War II decides to do ape research on Tenerife. It turns out that the ape research being done on Tenerife was done at a time in our nation's history when we were in war with Germany. This is a German psychologist doing ape research in the shipping lanes, and he had never done primate research in his life. So if he's never done primate research, and he had never worked in that area, so suddenly we have a German researcher who's doing primate research at Tenerife in the German shipping lanes, or in the American shipping lanes, or Allied shipping lanes. So it was kind of suspicious. And so we start thinking about what was happening at the time. Now, as I'm telling this story and doing this, it could help some people who have some foundational knowledge of what I'm talking about. But other people are saying, wait a minute, where is Tenerife? What kind of primate research are you talking about? What is Gestalt psychology? So what I'm getting at here is the storytelling method is anytime you're weaving a narrative around something, but it helps only certain people. And I'm not saying not to do it. I'm saying we should do it, but we should keep in our minds that if I'm doing it, we have to do it under the right scenarios. And I'll throw this out there, and I know you keep this in mind as well, which is great, but it's like if you're not careful and make your message clear, the next thing you know, you end up wearing a puffy shirt. What was that reference to? I heard that. How many of you knew that was Seinfeld? Raise your hand. How many did not know it was Seinfeld? Raise your hand. Okay, if I throw a quick statement in there like that, it's like the storytelling. So that's what I'm after. That's it. Now I got to move on here, but for whom would it work well? We flip these around, right? The individuals who do have a foundation of knowledge, who now have a better way of hanging on to it, it does what we call elaboration, helps with that. It helps a lot for interest. It helps a lot for understanding what's going on. It does a lot of good things. What I'm trying to do without being too depressing here, and I've spent too much time on this, is that any teaching method you pick will work for some people and not for other people. And as we're doing it, we start to say, okay, I think this will work well with class, and the better you augment it and the better you can put other things with it, but the better you're knowledgeable or thinking about your audience, the better it's going to be. But when somebody tells you the jigsaw method is fabulous, you should use the jigsaw method. And here's the data saying it's good. It means it's good for certain students under certain situations. Oh, you know what? You shouldn't do this because it's bad. It's bad for certain students under certain situations. Okay? That's the big message here. And the reason I spent like 10 minutes on this, because I got to tell you, I hear this non-stop. My students will tell you, have you ever had a student tell you that they prefer the lecture? Just raise your hand again. How many have had at least one student in the last couple of years that said, I prefer a lecture, I don't like group work? Okay, looking around, lots of those. If you think about why a student would say that, now I'm not gonna bait anybody into this. I've heard a lot of the discussion. Students like to be spoon-fed. They like to be told what's on the test. They don't want to do the work. I don't like that now. I used to say those things. I did early in my career. I've been teaching for a little over 30 years. I used to say that. Oh, the reason you don't like the lecture is because with the group work, you have to bring more energy, you have to bring more information. I don't know that that's true anymore. I think for lecture, the game is clear. Think about this for a second. If I'm lecturing, your job is to memorize what I say and then regurgitate it for the test. I use the word regurgitate. Reproduce it for the test. The proportion by which you can reproduce it for the test is the grade you get. If I tell you about operant conditioning and you don't get it, it's not my fault, it's you didn't get it. Here's the most important thing I can say about the lecture method is it shifts responsibility. If I do active engaged learning, if I do jigsaws and have people work in groups and you don't get it, people will say I didn't teach it. I've had colleagues tell me that. I started doing active learning in 1989. And my colleagues one time came to me, I was teaching statistics, he taught research methods, and try this for just a second. I put my students in groups. We did jigsaw. We did all this stuff. The next semester, one of my faculty member friends came up and he says, hey, Todd, I'm just curious. I'm teaching research methods, and I've got some students that were in your class, and they don't know what an independent sample t-test is. Did you cover the independent sample t-test? You should have in your class, right? And I said, oh, actually, yes. I had them do a jigsaw method where they actually each read about different types of t-tests. Then they came into the classroom and they taught each other how to do the t-tests. Oh, that's what you do. You know what'd be helpful in the future is if maybe you could teach them the t-tests. See how that framework goes? What I've done is I've shifted the responsibility over to the students. The issue is, now if you think about it from the student perspective, if I tell you, here's a one sample t-test, an independent sample t-test, a repeated measures t, here's how a z-test moves into a t-test, I tell you that and then you do the test, we all understand that gig. And if you get it wrong, you obviously just didn't learn it. If I have you work in groups and the tests come along and you can't do it, I'm telling you, time and again, students will say, oh, it's because you never taught it. And we're sitting back saying, no, we did teach it. I did it by setting up really good group works for you, really well-structured group work, and you should have gotten it when this happened. I think the problem with students right now is they don't understand the game for group work. And so if we can talk to them a little bit more and say, at the end of today, you did a whole bunch of group work stuff, let's see what you know at the end of the day. And then we summarize it and go through it. And then if I say to you, wow, I've been lecturing over this for 20 years and I've never had a group do this well, good for you. Now if they get it wrong on the test, they won't say you didn't teach it. So the point here is just shifting. So I think a lot of times when students say, I prefer the lecture, it's because they understand that. And then please keep this one in mind. I just talked to a young lady. She learns better from the lecture. She just does. The normal distribution stuff, there are some students who will still learn better. It does not mean we lecture all the time, but keep in mind that some students learn better that way. By the way, I will ask you one last thing here on this topic. If the president of the institution called you and said, hey, I need you to do this, or the superintendent, whoever it is, I need this report done in the next month. I can put you with 4 other people and the 5 of you can turn the report in next month, or you can just do it by yourself. How many of you in here, be honest here, would just say, you know what, I'll do it by myself? How many would pick individual? Look around the room, this is good. And how many of you would definitely say, no, I want the group? All right, this is good. Okay, so do this one last time. Look at the hands. Group people, put your hands up proudly. All right, individual people now, put your hands up proudly. So it's about 60-40 with individuals. Why in the world would we pick so regularly so many people? I've done this with lots of groups too. Individual always wins. If groups are so good and we believe in them so much, why do we pick individual? And I understand that I set up one scenario, but I got a lot of faculty members who will say, I don't allow students to pick their own groups, which actually it's not a good idea to let them pick their own groups. So I assign their groups. When you walk through the door and say, this chunk of the grade is going to be dependent on your group work, and by the way, here's who you're working with, we in the room will often say, I'd prefer not to do that. So I think we need to teach them better about that. And we can. Yes, Lisa. Yeah, which is why I think we raise our hands and say, if the president needs something, I'd rather just do it because I know what the product's going to be. I don't want to have my reputation and job dependent on 4 people I don't know. So that is an issue we come back to. I like to do group work where you do individual component and the group component. The biggest issue, though, and I think it's all true for us, if I said, hey, the president needs this report done or the superintendent needs the report done, so here's the deal. I would like you to oversee the group because you're really good at bringing projects in. I've asked the director of finance to work with you because there's a budget component to this, and that individual is going to bring all the financial component. I've asked the student affairs person to work with you because there's a student component, and you're going to have data from that person, and I've asked these other 2 people for these other reasons. And here's how it's structured. Here's how it's going to be done. When it's done, I'm going to ask you all to sign off on this thing, but you're each going to have your individual chapters that you're going to work on, so you are responsible for it being done. But if the budget gets all messed up, that's not your responsibility. The numbers, if they're wrong. All of a sudden, I'd like, whoa, I want to change my answer from individual to group. So I think we structure it differently. So the point here is just how do we do this? Okay. So here's the last chunk of it. Is if we're going to make this shift, I think there's a way we make this shift. So 31 years of teaching psych, cognitive psych, intro psych, history of psych. I love psych stuff. Here's what I've learned from cognitive. There you go. I like information processing view. It's a little bit older. It's back in the 70s, but by and large, it works well. I put this up there for just an impact slide. By the way, when I got to talk to Gates, I emailed them and said, I just sent you my slides. Please keep in mind that slide 15 is just there for impact only. It's not for information. And they said, whew, thank you for emailing us. We were going to uninvite you. So this would have cost me my chance to go talk to them. It's pretty complicated in some respects, although I will tell you right now, anybody with a background in the area would look at it and say, let's see, let me double check here. Yeah, elaboration, I see it starts over there. Starts here with retrieval because it always has to have some kind of a thought and a retrieving of a concept of some kind, and you put something new because every environment's new. You know, you can't step in the same stream twice, back to William James's stuff here. And then we come through here and we start working. Then you have your working memory, cognitive load, that comes down into here. And schemas. Yep, all makes sense. If you have a good solid foundation, you look at this and say, yep. If you have no foundation in it, you look at it and say, that's a lot of words. Now, if I put that up there and start talking about it, of course, then I'm going to really mess you up as students. So the point here is, it depends on who you are, how complex this is. So I'm going to break it down this way. I've chatted with so many people. Trying to break it down to the foundational components. I don't think it matters anymore. Please get away from the concept of lecturing, active learning, anything like that. What has to happen in the classroom? Number one, the learner has to attend to whatever is being learned. If there isn't an attention to the stimuli coming into the system, you can't learn. If somebody comes up and taps you on the back and you turn, that's stimuli coming in, the tapping on the back. If I'm walking along and hear a loud noise, that's stimuli coming in. If I tell you something, like psychology was founded in 1879, that's stimulus coming in. If you happen to be thinking about bacon, when I say psychology was founded in 1879, and while you hear it, you're hearing bacon, 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 I love bacon. And later I say, when was psychology founded as a science? And you get it wrong because you think bacon. Yeah, 1900, 1940, 1879, 1800, or bacon. So you pick bacon. No, if I give you the 4 dates and you get it wrong, you come back and say, you never covered that in class. And actually, I did. And how many times in our lives have we said, yeah, actually, I did talk about that in class. And then I say, hey, Susie, because I know Susie takes great notes. Susie, could you show me your notes from January 3rd? Oh, look it right there. It's bacon. It's good. It's right there. It's 1879. So the point here is, if they're thinking about something else, so you have to have their attention. They have to understand to some extent. Now, this one I put with a little qualifier on there. You don't absolutely have to have understanding, but it makes a massive difference. If I understand what I'm attending to, and then I have to have some value. How many times in your life have you processed information that has no value, that you attend to it, you understand it, and it's gone? Think about the last red light you stopped at, if you tend to stop at red lights. Been here for a few days. Some people do, some people don't. Okay, so if you stopped at a red light, what was the color of the car that was right behind you? Most of you knew it at the time because you stopped, you glanced around. At some point, you probably looked in the rearview mirror. Maybe you didn't, but oftentimes we do. And you might say, I have no clue. Your brain is wired to flush out all that stuff it doesn't need. But it will keep stuff of value. If a blue pickup cuts you off, you move over to the right lane, then it gets held up by somebody making a left-hand turn. You pass the blue pickup and go back in front of that vehicle, then get up to a red light, stop, look in the rearview mirror and think, who's in the front now? It was a blue pickup. I would know it's a blue pickup if it has some value or interest. If I pull up to a stoplight and the person next to me is dancing in their car, listening to music, I might laugh and smile. It has interest. So the point here is, if there is no value or interest, our brains are wired to flush that. So the concept is, how do we get their attention, their understanding, and their interest? Have you worked through something in just a second, but this is the last piece I have to throw in there. So I'm become a new fan of cognitive load, which I've always liked, but I'm becoming more and more of a kind of feeling like this is a foundational thing. Cognitive load, really, really basic way of looking at this. There is intrinsic. What I'm talking about cognitive load is in your working memory. Sensory memory is pretty much limitless. I could look at a football stadium, and for a quarter of a second, if I close my eyes, the whole football stadium's in there. Long-term memory. We have no recorded reports of long-term memory being filled except one Far Side cartoon. Says, excuse me, Mr. Jones, may I be excused? My brain is full. Aside from that, the concept now is that it's not, you know how much you hold in your long-term? It's astounding. Think of a house. Think of a house that you were in a lot when you were little, but haven't been in for a long, long time. If you can, anybody, can you think of a house like that? Could be a friend's house, could be your grandma's house, could be your parents' house and you moved. You haven't been in this house for a very long time, but you were in there a lot. How many windows were in that house? Now there's no way to know, right? Oh, wait a minute, I already see people. How many of you can start counting? Put your hands up real quick. Look at around the room. This is amazing. That's not something you've practiced. Do you take that for just an example? How many things you must have in your long-term memory if the number of windows in your friend's house is in there too? So the point is there's tons of stuff. However, short-term memory, working memory is even better. So working memory is how much you can hold at any given second, or any given moment's better word. So now that's what limits what goes through. That's your roadblock. That's you think about the cars on the roads. There's like almost an infinite number of cars around this area parked in their driveways and garages, and there's an infinite number of destinations almost. But once everybody gets on the road, there's a limit to how many roads you have, which means they choke down and they come to a stop. Working memory does that too. When you have too much information, you just stop. Now here's the deal. Cognitive load is that representation of this. So, inherent, intrinsic. Some things are harder than others. Organic chemistry is just a hard thing to get. Calculus is a hard thing to get. There are certain things that are just hard to process for lots of reasons. We can't change that. I use the golf course example though. We were talking in the golf course example about things on extraneous load. Those are extra things in your environment. So let's just try this for a second. What types of things in your environment would create extra energy, extra draw, or extra processing that have nothing to do with the thing you're trying to learn? I could be reading in my dorm. I could be watching TV and a documentary, I really want to get this part. I could be watching a movie that's coming to a really climactic scene. I could be listening to somebody who's explaining classical conditioning to me. So let me just ask you all right now, what are like 5 things that would just be extraneous to that would just make it harder? So what are some of these? A cell phone rings. There's actually some good data that suggests just a phone ringing in the room will detract from individuals who else are in the room. That's a good one. Cell phone ringing. The what? Social media. If you're on social media, if you're looking at it or somebody's sending you a text or something, so social media will do it. The temperature of the room. If the room is very uncomfortable. That's a good. That'll work. So if you got the temperature of the room, it's cold. It's better than being too cold than too warm, though. You'd all be sleeping if it's too warm. What else we got? The which? If you're hungry, that's an external stimulus. That's a good one because you're thinking about how hungry you are. Messy room. For some people, if you look around the room and it's messy, for some individuals, if you got a bulletin board that's just chocked full of stuff at the front of the room, that's actually distracting. So that could be it. That's external. Music in the next apartment or house. The what? Yeah, cat, dog, or baby, they're all kind of the same. If you got... You got a cat that's over in the corner, a baby's trying to sit in your lap again. So that's it. Yeah, one more. Yeah, other people eating, could be talking too, right? Conversations. You notice when you're driving down the road and everything is cool and you got the radio going, people chatting, and then it starts to snow. And it starts to snow a little bit and everything stays about the same. And then it snows a little bit more. Then you start to see some brake lights. Everybody starts slowing down. We say, hey, everybody, just be quiet. And you turn the radio off. What you're trying to do at that moment is you're reducing your extraneous load. And what we see, by the way, here's something for you to play around with in the future. You'll notice that when traffic and everything else gets really bad, watch how many times people who are driving will actually lean forward a little bit. I've watched this over and over again. I'm driving along, it's getting really slippery, the roads are getting bad, and the person will lean just like an inch, just a little bit more forward. Like, I couldn't see, but I can now. But what it also does is to say, I got an idea. because it's dangerous driving conditions and there's a higher probability of an accident, I should get closer to the airbag. This is bad news all the way around. But the point is, when I tell people, be quiet and everything else, it's cognitive load. I was driving and it was fine. Now it's not. If you're putting together an IKEA bookcase and you've laid out all of the screws and the bolts and the exploding diagrams and everything, and it's all laid out, and then your significant other comes into the door and says, hey, I was thinking about spring break and maybe we should rent a house on the beach and it'd be really fun, and you think, not now. That not now is cognitive load. You are full from this, not now. If this is the fourth bookcase you have built, though, I'm making a shift. This is your fourth bookcase from IKEA. Open up the box, you know what it's going to be like. You throw the bolts and different things. You actually walk through the door with like 10 little bowls, and you put the bowls down because you're going to drop each of the types of screws in those bowls. You get it all lined up. Somebody comes in and says, where do you think we should go on spring break? You say, well, you know, we could rent a house on the beach. That would be good. And you're still setting things up. This is dual processing. Or not dual processing. This is actually processing two things, though. It's multitasking. You know what? It's multitasking. People say you can't multitask. You can multitask. You can multitask as long as you don't max out cognitive load. Watch this. See what I'm doing right now? I am walking and talking at the same time. That is pure out multitasking right there. I can watch. Ooh, look at this. I'm walking and talking, but I'm walking backwards. Let me show you one last part of this. Is really pretty cool, though. A lot of these things we just don't think about. I am walking and talking and throwing water into the air. Wait, did you catch what just happened, though? I stopped walking and I stopped talking and caught the water, which means I moved from multitasking to task shifting. I shifted the energy from the one task over to the other task so I could do it. People do this naturally all the time without realizing they're doing it. So when somebody says, oh, you know, you can't multitask, yes, you can. Our lives would look really sad if we couldn't. Can you imagine trying to go for a walk with somebody? Hey, Sue, I was thinking maybe tomorrow we could go have lunch somewhere. Maybe at the deli. Would you be available at noon? Sounds good. That would be a weird life. So what we do instead is we can multitask as long as we don't max out our cognitive load. So the last piece here is this germane load. It's how we process stuff. The more I walk, the better I get at it, the less energy it takes. It becomes what's called automaticity. It's automatic. As it becomes automatic, it takes less cognitive energy. I can put other stuff with it. Whew. This is why we have to memorize those things. Oh, Dr. Z, I can look up all these terms. Why should I have to memorize things like unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response? I say those are words in our vocabulary. I got an idea. Why don't we not memorize anything? We'll just look it up, including words, because that's all they are in psychology, is they're just words, right? Tensile strength is just a word. Cognitive load is just, sunk cost is just a word. I mean, all these things we have, deficits, just a word. Credits, debits, these are all words. We have words within our discipline. We have to learn the vocabulary of our discipline, because think about what's happening here. When you use a word over and over and over again, you actually reduce the germane load. You reduce the load on that, which means you can process it very, very quickly without burning much energy. If you have to think about what the word means, that's because it's not automaticity. Now you have to put energy into thinking what the word means, and that goes along with everything else and can close down your processing. I have so much respect for non-native speakers who sit in our classroom, because they have to get this down. They have this when the rest of us don't. We're at Middlesex, so I'll ask this question too. Here. Who is the first president of Middlesex? Everybody know? What name came to mind when I said who is the first president of Middlesex? George Washington. That's a good one. As soon as I say who is the first president, Washington, of Middlesex, I don't know. So we do this stuff real quickly, but the point is the fact that Washington comes up really quickly means it just is there. Now, in the classroom, we are fine as long as we're not maxed out on cognitive load. There's going to be a certain amount of intrinsic load that's going to be there because of the difficulty level of the material. Then there's going to be extraneous load, side conversations. me telling you quick stories that have nothing to do with the content. All this type of stuff that's going on, a cold room and being hungry and no bacon and all this stuff is all swirling around. If you happen to be really good and know the content, you can handle the extra load. If you don't know the content well, then you can't handle the extra load. Then we throw that in there with this germane load concept. The better you get at it, the easier it is. This is why you can walk into a classroom and teach something and walk out saying, that was great. The students walk out saying, oh my gosh, my head hurts. If you've ever had students who have said, I'm exhausted after this, or why don't we meet, here's one, why don't we meet after class? I see that you didn't do well on the last exam. On Wednesday, I have time right after class. Let's rethink that now. If the class itself happened to be a lower cognitive load class period, maybe with some good group work, maybe just some interactive stuff, maybe a lecture that was a repeat of some of the past stuff, but I'm now teaching in a way that was not a heavy cognitive load day. You could then step into my office hour afterward, it would be okay. But imagine this is the day that I'm going to explain to you why a failure to respond in a classically conditioned paradigm may actually be the failure of a learning to actually happen, or an inhibitory stimulus blocking the excitatory stimulus. And if I have that day, and at the end of the day you kind of get it with spontaneous recovery, and we're also going to do generalization, and we do, we got to do extinction. And at the end of that class period, I say, today's when we're meeting in my office hour, right? I feel great, but you as a student don't. So the point here is we have to be careful with that. Here's a dilemma. Returning students, non-traditional students. If you're teaching an evening class from 7 to 10, you know that most of those students, if they want to talk to you, there are only two options, right? 6:30 to 7 or 10 to 10:30. If those are my two options, if you come into if I say, this is better for an evening class, we're going to have class from 7 to 10 p.m., and I know you've been struggling in the class, so let's go over your first exam. We've gone a couple of classes past that. Before the next exam, we need to go over it. So I'll tell you what, I will hang around after class, let's go over that. The student's just done 3 hours of new material, and now you're going to sit down and go over the last exam that they struggled with anyway. Bam, cognitive load, they're maxed out. So the reason I'm spending quite a bit of time on this, if we start thinking about this and say, when are your students maxed out for cognitive load and when are they not, starts to change the game. I want to leave some time for some questions here in a second too, so we already did that one. So, back to attention real fast. Those three things: attention, understanding value, attention, understanding value, attention, understanding value. Brain seeking novel stimuli all the time. So the first question I have for you is, how do we get their attention and maintain it? You ever go down a long road, no other traffic around, especially late at night, and catch yourself like dozing off? Or if there's a train that runs next to your apartment and somebody comes over for dinner and they say, how can you stand that train being there? And you say, what train? Oh yeah, don't even notice anymore. Or they come over and say, my daughter's condo, I bought this little condo, it was actually cheaper than rent, it was a crazy thing. So I got this little condo, people upstairs running back and forth. Say, how can you study with people running? Oh yeah, I forgot about them. That happens all the time, right? The brain is wired to discount constant stimuli. So we have to be careful when we teach, mixing things up. So here's the quick question for you. So how do you start a class? If you're going to start a class period and you want to have a hook, you want to draw them in, I'm going to just try this for, again, just a couple of minutes. Just chat with, tell you what, just the person next to you now, instead of the whole table, just the person next to you, not the whole table. Just take let's do 2 minutes total. For 2 minutes, here's what I'd like to do. I want to be very specific on this. When I teach this thing, here's a way that I can hook them. So what I'm not after here is, I like to play music, or I like to just make them feel more relaxed. Those aren't hooks for specific classes. It's what do you do to just draw their attention in, okay? So let's try this for like 2 minutes. What can you do to draw a student's attention? 2 minutes. All right, let's stop that. Let's see what you came up with. So, anybody catch anything that I've done to try to either draw or maintain attention? Yep, stories. So I have told several stories. Anybody else catch what them? I do move around. There's a big difference. As I move around, I'm walking around. If I stand in one place specifically, we talk about the brain shutting down constant stimuli. If I stood behind this lectern, in fact, You can see me as a human. If I'm back here, I'm just a head. All right? Do you remember what I did for a while to actually lose your attention on purpose? As the monotone, right? I took out the variability in my voice. Your brain will start to discount constant stimuli. So if I quit moving and I start to use a monotone, I've removed several pieces of variability in my presentation, and all of a sudden you lose it. David Letterman, I used to watch him. I used to be fascinated by him. Think about the job of a talk show host. They have to catch your attention when you're sitting comfortably on a couch and you got dogs running around and babies running around and all this other stuff, and they've got to get your attention. He would say things like, listen to this, listen to this. If you're doing a monologue and someone says, listen to this, those are words that we catch quickly that we say, ooh, listen to this, and you turn, because that's almost a conditioned response to that. And he used to say, oh, this next one, this is a really good one, as opposed to the rest, which were not, I guess. So he'd have these phrases and different things he would do that he would bring this stuff in. And so that's what he would do. So what are some of the things you do? So just a couple of these quick. Yes, right in the back. A shocking story. Like what kind of a shocking story? Yes. All right. Well, it could be like, now I see, but I already want to know what this shocking story is, which is exactly why you tell it, right? So the shocking story is something that draws a person, as long as it's not shocking in a point that actually shuts somebody down, because this is always dangerous these days, but yes, shocking story, something that's counterintuitive. You know what I would say? I love this too. The shocking story is typically a counterintuitive story, right? Something you wouldn't expect in a general field that's out there, and because it's very unusual or something you would never expect, that makes it shocking. So something that just violates your assumptions. I love this. Yes? Excellent. Oh, okay. I love conformity stuff. Yes. So, right, and basically what you've done is, and I love this too, in case, again, for the microphone stuff, is violating social norms, which is exactly the same as the shocking story in some respects. The shocking story is a verbal way of doing it. You're doing it physically, but you're both doing the same thing. You're taking essentially a hypothesis and just messing with the ending. And so that's one of the things. You ever stop and think for just a second? I love digging down one layer and seeing what this. You ever wonder why kids, little children, love to hear the same story? You know how it gets mind-numbing? If you got to tell going on a bear hunt one more time, or King Big Good in the bathtub and he won't get out, or the bear under the stairs, or the mouse in the strawberry. Ooh, if you give a mouse a cookie. Think for a second, why do you think kids love to hear the exact same story over and over and over again? You ever think about that one? They did what? They do enjoy the feel. They understand. They're making hypotheses, aren't they? Try changing the words on some of those pages. You've done that because you're bored out of your mind. And as soon as you change the words, they say, no, Daddy, that's not the way the story goes. When they say that's not the way the story goes, they're formulating a hypothesis. But keep in mind, they're very, very young. I do this to represent young. They're very tiny. And so in their field, it's like they don't know a lot of what's going on, but I know how this story ends with the mouse, and they want to hear this, and then they say, yes, and you change it, and it does add interest for us, and sometimes the kids go, no, and they laugh and stuff. These are all hypotheses that we're forming. So in the classroom, when you violate a norm, you violate a hypothesis. That's going to draw interest because like, whoa, that's not what people do. Freaks them out. Go step into an elevator and just stand nose to nose with somebody. How you doing? They may punch you, but the idea is you have violated this, and they are going to go home. And you know what's funny about this one? They will go home and they will tell their family, and this is why you do it, they will tell their family about the person who got on the elevator and looked at them. They got on that elevator every day and never talk about it, but this day they're going to talk about it. I wonder if you wear your clothes inside out and facing the other direction, does it wash out? So, no, it doesn't. All right, so these are violating hypotheses. Other things we can do?
I'll bring a couple students up to the front with me.
Excellent. So we bring students up. What does that do?
Get everybody's attention. Nobody has to prove. I'm going to do, but I'll give them all the role play.
Yes.
And then ask the students, what do they think we're going to be talking about?
Excellent. And again, I'm trying to hit this carefully because we also don't know what's going to happen, right? It's uncertainty. A huge aspect of drawing attention is to have uncertainty involved in some way. Yes, ma'am. Excellent. Excellent. I love this. So you bring in current events, and you show them this stuff applies to real world stuff, and here's what's happening, here's the outcome. One of the things you're really getting across implicitly to them is, without really coming out and saying this thing, is you're going to understand this. When other people see this happening, they're not going to know what's really going on. They're going to think of it at a superficial level, critical thinking. You're going to look at it and say, no, I don't think that's what's going on. So here's two things. I've so far narrowed everything you've done to two things. Violating an assumption. I'm going to do something that's going to shock you, either with a story or a behavior or bringing students up to the front of the room. We never know what's going to happen when you bring a student up to the front of the room. So we have now set up a scenario where we have unexpectedness and or we have violated an assumption, or the other one was drawing interest. If I show you a current events thing, this is why this is important. This is back to that whole type of thing. You've got to have attention, you got to have understanding, you got to have some value. You're bringing value in. This is why you should pay attention. And so we do this. Now I'm going to keep going because we're about out of time here. But the concept here is, what do you do to draw them in? Everybody out there in the world of television, movies, business, and everything else, they are working on the hook all the time. If you have a business, you have to know, how do you hook your clients? If you're going to be in a consulting, you have to know, how do you hook people? If you're going to be running a television program, if you have a TV program, my wife and I used to play this game for a while when I was first thinking about this stuff, is I'd say, tell you what, tell me when you decide you do or do not want to watch this show. And we'd watch something like Blacklist. And it would start out, and it was like 30 seconds in, okay, I want to see how this ends. Watch how all these CSIs, all the same formula. Oftentimes what they'll do is they'll do the crime up front, and then they solve it. You know, when I was young, that was never done. You never started a TV show with the crime. You started building up to the crime. But nowadays, they figured this out. You show something, and so oftentimes I'll do this with my students too. Did you know 11 million jobs came out, 80,000 went to people with no education. 80,000. They have no future. I mean, this for the most part, if you don't have a college degree, you're really sunk. Let's figure out why. What I've just done is the same thing as CSI does. Here's the crime. Now let's explain it. So the point there is I've flipped it around, and so I think that can happen. But the point is, be thinking about it, always thinking. Every class period, today. And the same thing with the television programs. What I'll try to do now is when I teach a class, it's like, where do I know I've got them? Now, if I come in and tell you, okay, today we're going to do distribution of sample means. You see, if what we're going to do is be able to take a sample and make an assumption about a population, then we can't measure the whole population. So what we'll do is we will take small samples of multiple groups, and then we're going to take the average of those small samples. Now, how many of you I have hooked so far? Only the statisticians. That would be a terrible way to start class. And yet I spent years teaching like that. I'd come in because I thought, this is exciting, let's go. I never thought, how do I make sure they're hooked in? So now I would come in and basically tell them, oh, here's one for you. I'll go back to where t-tests come from. Hey everybody, today we're going to do t-tests. Imagine we have a whole vat of beer. I have 500, I'm going to put it as 500 gallons of beer, and I want to know whether that vat is good. We could drink the whole vat and say, that was good, but we've got nothing to sell. We could take one sip and say, ooh, that's pretty good, and sell it, but I'm not sure if the whole vat's good. How could we make sure that's good beer? And at that point, my students would be like, oh, all right, well, let's think about that. And somebody would say, well, we could take samples. I'd say, how many samples? I don't know, let's take like 100, okay? Anybody else have something? Let's take 20. How would we know how many samples we should take? Because the answer is roughly 30. And so the point here is, we're going to start talking about it, but now what I've done, and it's not necessarily storytelling here, is I've started out with a hook of this is why, same thing as current events. This is why it's important. So the point is we have to think of something. Now with multitasking, what's the important thing about multitasking is to think about how we actually process information. And you notice that none of you are listening to anything I'm saying right now. Well, some of you are, but most of you were reading. Ha, 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 ha. I did that on purpose. Cognitive load, attention. If I put a slide up here with words on it and start to explain what's there, if I put a slide up there with words on it and start to explain what's there, people will automatically read first. If they've got pencil and paper in hand, they'll start writing. If they've got a laptop, they'll just type it out. Research coming out now, which is fascinating. Is it better to take, love this stuff. You learn more from writing notes by hand or taking notes on your laptop? The answer is by hand most, right? How many of you have heard by hand? How many of you heard there's no real difference? How many of you are just still thinking about bacon? All right. It's too dang hot in here too. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Here's what I'm fascinated by. Research is coming out right now that says you learn more by taking by hand than by laptops. I think this is a mistake too. Here's the problem. The research methodology's been set up. They typically don't do it in the classroom. They'll bring people into the lab. They'll let them watch a video. There'll be a group that will take notes by hand, another group that takes notes by the laptop, and then afterwards they'll give you a quiz over the material, and the quiz on the material is it's about, I can't remember what it was, a half a standard deviation or so was better by taking them by hand than by laptop. Okay? There's a big problem here. What we're doing is we're telling people write stuff down and then we're going to give you the quiz, right? Seems like a fair game. But what I noticed when I read through all the research is the one huge finding is not how well they retrieved the information, it was how many words they recorded. You see, with laptops, they tend to record massively more information than they do with handwritten. Because of that, people have come out and said, this is the problem. When people take notes with laptops, they can type so much faster than they could write. They actually type more stuff, which means they can transcribe it and get more stuff down. And because you can get more stuff down, you're not actually processing what's going on and picking the important stuff, you're just writing stuff. So now I'm typing mindlessly instead of writing mindfully. Okay? And as a result, people are banning the laptops in the classroom. Now please just listen carefully to this next one, because otherwise I'm going to get in big trouble. If you ban laptops in the classroom because the students tend to type mindlessly instead of taking good notes, which the research shows the notes are better than the laptop, then I think we should think this through in another realm. Imagine you go to a really bad movie, and the movie is so bad you're looking at your watch quite a bit, and as you keep looking at your watch, you realize you're not paying attention to the movie. So now, the way we could actually make movies better is to ban watches. I just posted that somewhere and someone told me I was snarky. We wouldn't ban watches to make the movie better. If students type mindlessly in class, it's not the laptop's fault, right? We think that if we take the laptops away, then they will write better notes, and because they're writing better notes, they're going to then learn the material better. We could do two other things that I think would be even better. We could teach them how to take notes on laptops, which is different than paper and pencil, or we could teach in such a way that they aren't just trying to type a whole bunch of stuff down. So I could teach my students. I could say, okay, everybody, technology free for 5 minutes. Let's talk about this item, 10 minutes. Let's talk about the concept. After we've talked about it, okay, pull out your devices, pull out your notes, however you want to take the notes. What's the essence? What did we just learn here? And if someone says, well, we learned this and this and this, you could type on the laptop, you could write about by hand. I don't think there'd be any difference. I think we could wash out the difference between handwritten and typing by teaching the students how to type and use the typewriter for an effective data gathering method. Keep in mind that there was a time that people said writing was going to be the downfall of good, solid human thought. It's a lazy way of reproducing your environment. You can remember it, you can learn it, or you could write down notes. It's the way of actually making things more lazy. So we've always had this argument around, and the reason I wanted to go into this for just a second is when we throw something up on a screen and start talking, we're actually doing the same type of thing. We're saying, okay, now what the research has found, but you're going to be reading. If it's a lot of text and I read it, you don't read at the pace that I talk. So all the way around, the best thing to do is to say, take a look at this. And what I typically will do is read it in my head. Now what this research says, and if I've done that, now I have to keep in mind, are you writing this down? If you've got your laptop out and you're typing it, you're going to type verbatim what's up there. If you've got your handwritten, you're writing it by hand, you're not going to write it all down because you don't like to write that much. You're going to write down the final things. If I said, there's some great research about cell phones on the in the classroom on the desks, and it does certain things. What I want you to do is jot down either on your laptop or in your notes, what's the finding, what's the essence of what's here. Don't write down the word for word, write down the essence. And now I'm teaching them how to take notes. But by the way, we did find that multitasking will do this. The other thing that we know from this is that the brain will go where interest lies. And if I've got something really interesting like my cell phone that's got the world, and I'm talking, and the instructor is talking about something I don't care about, we're going to get distracted. So we know that this happens all the time. So here's my end result, because I'll try to leave a few minutes at the end we can talk to, but should we ban laptops in the classroom? Number one, be really, really careful. I have heard a faculty member say, laptops are banned in my classroom unless you have an accommodation. If you have accommodation, you may use them. I found that atrocious. We should say things like, tongue-in-cheek, be careful here, bazinga. Hey, if you have a note taker, could you raise your hand so I can see who the note takers are? If you need extra time in here, could you please stand up right now because I want to see who I need to give extra time to? If you actually have a cognitive impairment that makes it difficult for you to see contrast on the board and you need me to give you some extra handouts, just come up to the front of the room and I'll hand them to you at the beginning of every class. And we would sit back and say, no, no, no. Laptops, you can use them if you have a disability. Not only does it say, here's my flag and I have an accommodation, the person sitting next to that person is in fact going to say, I don't know why you get to use your laptop. I struggle with this too, which actually is not too far off. If the criteria from, I don't need any kind of accommodation, I'm totally fine is here, over here is I can't even operate. Somewhere along the line, we're going to draw a line and say from here out, you can use laptops. What about the people right next to that line? My whole life has been I've spent life doing different things. I would love to see disability student services, accommodations, I'd love to see them gone. All accommodations gone. If you think about it for a minute, if we could get rid of accommodations and be fair to students, we would have the best possible world. An accommodation is a way to try to accommodate for the fact that we've set up an environment to which the student struggles. If I could build an environment in which you didn't struggle, like if I had no time tests, I don't need to provide an accommodation to give you extra time. If I give everybody notes, I don't need an accommodation that some of you get notes. If I use everything with high contrast, I don't need to accommodate for the people who aren't able to see with high contrast. So the point is, we can do that. So the issue here is, how do we keep the students' attention and keep them going? Understanding. Let's try this one real fast. We got just a few minutes. So what are some ways of, just 3 or 4 real clever ways, how do we know prior understanding? I want to know prior knowledge. I'm starting to teach a class in cognitive psych. How do I know where people are? So what are let's do 4. I've never done the 4 yet. Yes, one way of, how do I know prior knowledge? The which? KWL. What is a KWL? Yeah. Catch that? KWL. What do you know? What do you want to know? What have you learned? What do you know? What do you want to know? So I'm asking them, what do you know? Yes. We could use any kind of formative assessment. Formative assessments, of course, are when we're not going to grade you on this. We just want to give you some feedback. We figure out where we're at. So what's a good formative assessment we could use here? Excellent. This is a stop and write. Basically what you're saying is, and you could do this either during the class to see if they've got it or not, you could do it at the beginning of class. Hey, today we're going to be talking about scaffolding. What I'd like you to do is right now write down what you know about scaffolding. You got 30 seconds to write as much as you can. Turn to your neighbor, see what your neighbor wrote, compare to what you wrote, see if you'd like to augment it with anything. And now what I'd like you to do is formulate one question based on what you and your neighbor did. 2 of you talk to each other. What's one thing you wish you knew? And then write that down. I mean, what I'm doing here is to try to get a sense of where you're at. Yes, one more here. There we go. There's all kinds of technologies. Kahoot is a game kind of system. We could use poll everywhere and ask you a poll question. I could actually ask you to raise your hands. We could use clickers. One thing I like about hands versus clickers is they don't run out of batteries, and the students almost always bring them to class. I could even say, I want you to raise your hands. I'm going to ask you a question. To what extent do you think this? And if you really believe it, I want 5 fingers up. If you don't believe it, but you're going to kind of go along with, I'll go with this, but I'm not sure I really believe in it, then you put no fingers up. And if I do that, I have to tell my students, if it's one finger, it's got to be this one. Because they think it's hilarious to flip you off in class. So the point here is, I could ask them to raise hands. I just talked to a faculty member who said in a room like this, we don't often have extra room, but here we do. I could just say, okay, this is one perspective, that's a different perspective, stand up and walk to the spot that's where you believe you are on this perspective for prior knowledge of the concept. Now what I want you to do is look around and catch the visual glaze, catch somebody on the other side that's kind of lined up with you and walk over and talk to them. It's easy if there's a small number, big ones it's harder. But the point is just, how do you know? And then that's prior knowledge. Also, at any given moment, keep in mind, as soon as a moment passes, the previous moment was prior. So prior knowledge is halfway through class, I could say, okay, what did you learn from the first half? So then we have classroom assessment techniques. There's tons of them out there. The point is, if we don't stop and do that periodically, not only do we not know where the students are, neither do they. Have you ever lost your car at the mall? If you ever known of anybody who's lost their car at the mall, or your keys, this is even a better one. You come home at 5 o'clock, you get ready to leave the next morning at 8 o'clock, it's like, oh man, where are my keys? Here's the cool part. You came home at 5, you're looking for your keys at 8 a.m., your keys have been lost since 5:05 p.m. You didn't know they've been lost since 5:05 p.m. because you never tried to retrieve them. The moment you tried to retrieve them was the first instance in your brain where you said, ooh, I don't know where they're at. If somebody had asked you at 6:30, where's your keys, you would have said, I don't know. Now there's probably a period from 5 to 5:10, 5:15, you'd be able to retrace your steps and say, oh, I came in, I went by, I put them in my bedroom. But now you have to actually go back and use cues. Those cues fade away. Now translate that to the classroom. If I teach you something at 11:30, it could be that 11:35 you no longer know it, but you can retrieve it from some cues. It could be at 11:50 you don't know it and there's less cues. It could also be that given that today is a Friday, by next Friday it's completely gone, mostly because the cues are gone. The students don't know if they don't know until they try to retrieve it. Retrieval is an absolute critical aspect of teaching and learning, and it's the one thing that we typically as faculty members will say, I don't have time to stop my class and to have them write for a minute and then talk to their neighbor. I have too much to cover. Well, if you've got that much to cover, how do you know when they know it? So that's the concept that we have to play around with. And again, cognitive load stuff. If I'm maxed out on cognitive load, 5 minutes later you ask me to do something, I still can't do it. It never went in. But at least I would know it then. So it's huge. I don't care about that. The value has to be there. I did want to leave a couple minutes, so I got to rip through. I want to just get through the cognitive load stuff, and then the rest of it was just some ancillary quick, here's some things to think about as you leave. But the attention grabbers, we already did one of those. You turn to your neighbor, you talk about how do we get the attention? And keeping in mind social contagion is huge. See, that was the other part that I did over here. Energy level changed when I did this. When I sit over here and start talking like this, I can actually tell you the social contagion is set up so that if I show less energy, you're actually going to experience less energy, and in a very short period of time, you're going to feel more lethargic. And, well, that just happens because we're social animals and we tend to draw energy from each other. That's what social contagion is. So you can see right now, even though I told you what I'm doing, it feels different in the room. If I start bouncing around and saying this stuff, and you don't have to jump all over the place. I could just stand here and say, driving along the other day with 3 physicians in the car. We got on an on-ramp to go onto a highway. If you've never been on a highway in the United States, basically what happens is as you get on the road, you can only go in one direction. If you want to go in the other direction, you may have to wait 5 to 7 miles before you take an off-ramp and go in the other direction. So we start on the on-ramp, 3 physicians. I see an accident has just happened. It's just happened. And you can tell because there's no emergency vehicles, but you see a person staggering out of a vehicle and somebody else helping. So at this point, I have to decide with the 3 physicians, what do? It's a busy expressway. We're coming into the traffic. What happens next? Now, I can do that and demonstrate social interest, energy. That's got some value to it. If I stood there and said, oh, I was driving on the road one day and I had 3 physicians with me and we saw an accident. See, I can change it very quickly. I don't have to be bouncing around the room. It's how I tell it. If I can sell it, then the students care. And some of you have already said this one. If you can sell it, if they really get it, but that's why, it's social contagion. We couldn't live as social beings if we weren't attuned to each other's energy. Could you imagine if you found a $100 bill walking into rolling around in the parking lot and you were the very first person here? Otherwise, most of you would spend half the time trying to figure out whose $100 bill it was. But if you were the very first person and there's no other cars around and it's just blowing across the parking lot, you'd look around and say, ooh, this one's mine. And if you come in the door and I tell you, how's it going? And you know me and say, hey, it's going great, Todd. I just found $100. I say, well, that's great for you. And congratulations on finding the money. You immediately would say, what's wrong, right? Because you immediately would notice the difference in our energy and that something's up. And if I said, oh, I just got a call, my cat's really sick, and I've had this cat for like 15 years and she's really sick. And you said, oh no, what's happening? Your energy levels come down a little bit. You've asked me about my life, so it comes up a little bit, and we start to be able to talk. We couldn't talk if we didn't kind of come to an agreement of where we should be. So that just happens naturally. If you walk in the classroom and you think the material is boring, so will your students. So we can use little memes. Here's one of my favorites. When I die, I want my group project members to lower me into the grave so they can let me down one last time. We can add photos, we can add images, but the point is we can do something to bring up some value. So we want to get the attention, we want to get the understanding, we want to get the value. And I know we're right to time now, so let me just say, there's our understanding, value, and interest. The last ones, and I wasn't going to go into deep stuff here, but the concept is elaboration. You've already taught stories. Stories, we call them, they elaborate. They tie to other things. If we can tie things to other things, we learn a lot better. Repetition. Repetition is set up so that basically every time you use a trail, it becomes more and more grooved. It's called long-term potentiation. First President, George Washington. Give me another word for building. Give me another word, or what types of vehicles are there? Anything like that. The more you've used certain things, the easier they come up. So when students say, why do I have to keep going over this? I already learned this once. You don't study something until you know it. You study until you can't miss it. You don't do it until you get it right. You do it until you can't get it wrong on certain things, certain verbiage, certain things I have to have down. But the point is, there's a physiological process. The more you do it, the better you get at it. Easier it comes up, then I can multitask. The easier I can draw it up and multitask, the less cognitive load there is, so I can put other stuff with it. You want to know how experts can talk about stuff so easily and bring stories up? Cognitive load is low because automaticity is high. I've talked about classical conditioning so much that I can tell you the unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, the second order conditioning, extinction, all these things. But it's only because I've done it for years and years and years. By the way, that's not going to amaze your students. It's going to make them go, ooh, that's a lot. So we have to be careful with that. This is a study I don't care about. We see this all the time, by the way. If I said, try to remember those 3 words, try to remember these 3 words, or these 3 letter combinations, the first 3 letter combinations, and I ask you a couple of minutes later, the 3 on the left are easy. Actually, the 3 on the right, any one of those easier than the others? Would be. Which one of those 3 would you remember the easiest? BTL is one. Why BTL? It just looks like BTL? I bet you think of something. What does it remind you of? Okay, right, a hamburger, a BLT, except it's BTL. Our brains are so fickle that we could even say, I know it's not BTL or BLT. BLT is the sandwich. I know it's not BLT, but it's those 3 letters. Oh, it's BTL, because I know it starts with B. There's only one other combination. All that goes in, but because of elaboration, even though you put that much energy into it, it makes it faster to remember than BTAL, which I don't really know what to do with that. Anybody else got another one that they could remember quickly? Yeah. BOA PAP. What are the two things? BOA and PAP. You can actually make two words out of that one, because anytime we do a consonant, vowel, consonant, we can pronounce that. So BOA PAP, there we go. We got it. Yeah, there you go. So what we're doing on any of these is we're elaborating on it. We're putting it into a structure. Whenever we do that, we make life easier. So that's it. I mean, if we can repeat things over and over again, it makes it easy to process it. If we elaborate and tie with other things, then it works really well. And then we got it. The only last thing is, and this one, don't read any of these slides. NASA astronaut study, people who nap in the afternoon had a 34% increase in cognitive functioning over people who didn't nap. Tons of research on the value of sleep. I just did a guest presentation in a first-year seminar course. 8:30 in the morning, those students were dog tired. They were so tired. We spent the entire time talking about sleep. Think about it for a second. If you're so exhausted that you can't process information, you can't process information. We also know, by the way, sleep is related to weight gain. You lose weight while you sleep. People who can't seem to lose weight, check their sleep patterns. We also know that has all kinds of effects on the immune system. It just, if you're not sleeping much, and by the way, the sleep is considered right now to be a national crisis because our brains were never wired to have all this stuff around all the time, so we don't know really how to handle it. Sleep problems. Exercise, the best thing people can do in addition to sleep for learning is actually exercising. Sustained aerobic exercise actually increases the ability to learn and the ability to focus and to have patience. All those things, and mood changes. We know what it's like to wake up in a bad mood. Also the concept if you run a lot and then stop running, we know what that's like. So we know that. Hydration. We now can measure, it used to be 10%. Now they're starting to see decrements in cognitive processing from a 1% decrement in hydration. By the way, you know that idea that caffeinated beverages actually dehydrate you? I've been talking about that for years. New studies out saying that's not true at all. If you have no caffeine in your system and you drink one caffeinated beverage, it actually reduces the amount of volume of liquids in your system a little bit over the amount you've drunk because of the caffeinated part of it. But if you drink caffeine all the time, it turns out it doesn't. I was stunned by that, actually. Brand new research out on that. And then it's what you eat. Whew, we did it. So, why is group work so powerful? It helps you with attention. It helps with understanding. Attention is, hey, we can't have cell phones out when we're working in a small group. If someone says, I don't know why we have to learn this stuff, and I say, well, here's why, that brings value. If someone says, I don't get it, and I explain why, that brings that. Group work works because it has attention. If it's good, it has attention. It helps you with understanding. It can help you with value. Elaboration, as we can talk, so it elaborates. Repeating, as we talk about it, we're practicing repetition of bringing the stuff out. It does all those things it should do, unless the group work doesn't do those things. If it doesn't do those things, it's not valuable. You've all seen bad group work. Bad group work are the things that don't have those components. Lectures. When's a lecture good? A lecture is powerful when it has attention, understanding, value, allows you to elaborate, and gives you a practice at repetition. If it does those things, then a lecture is good. So when somebody says, you know, lectures are better, or active learning is better than lecturing. No. Things that result in attention, understanding, value, repetition, elaboration are better than things that don't. If a lecture does that, it's better. If an active learning thing does that, it's better. If cognitive load comes into play, if I'm lecturing for 5 minutes and I have those things, then you fill up, I have to stop and do an activity or do something that allows you to solidify and consolidate that information, or else you're just full. And so when people say, and this is, I promise this will be it, we started just a hair late, I'm only 5 minutes late, this is perfect. If people say we should take a break after 15 or 10 minutes because students get bored, please stop that. I think what we're doing is we're feeding into a system that I don't like at all. I like to assume that the learning is going on. After 10 or 15 minutes, they're going to be, if you're lecturing, cognitive, if you're doing the right job, cognitive load should be full. Now at 15 minutes, if I've given you enough information, it really makes your head swimming and I can't do much more than this, then I should have an activity that allows you to consolidate that information and do something with it. I'm not stopping because you're bored And I'm not stopping to give you a break. I'm stopping because I've likely lost your attention. Cognitive load means you're lacking understanding. So let's stop and do something to bring that in. But I'll tell you, you'll change the conversation in education if we quit saying, let's add an active learning as a break because students get bored, and instead start saying, let's add active engaged learning because it allows us to consolidate the information that's given when you lecture. And it tells you why you need to stop lecturing sometimes, and it tells you why active learning is important. But it doesn't say stop lecturing and do active learning. It says make sure the components are there. Lecturing is not more effective or less effective. It just is to the extent it does these things. Passive learning, same thing. You can be passive learning and still learning as long as you have all those components. You ever sat in a really good movie and actually walked out and had your life changed or learned from a movie? That's passive. You ever read a book? Passive learning doesn't work? Tell me that books can't be informative. I read Moby Dick. It's just a book. Passive learning. I didn't get in groups. I didn't do anything. Can't learn from that. The concept is that if you have attention, understanding, value, and those things, you'll have learning. All right, I do have to stop there. I think lunch is coming. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and play around a little bit.
Thank you so much, Todd. Let's give him one more round of applause for an excellent presentation. I never get tired of listening to you, Todd. I always learn more every time I listen to Todd, and hopefully you got a lot out of this morning's session as well. So I want to just make a couple of announcements. We're going to shift to lunch in a moment. I wanted to, first of all, thank Middlesex County College for obviously giving us the space to be in, but also they are the ones that provide the CEUs and the PD credits. So if you are able to stay all day, we are able to give those out to you at the end of the day. They will be distributed over in Craybeal Hall, so you don't need to come back here again after you leave here for lunch and you go to your breakouts. We'll have a table set up over in Craybeal Hall there for you to pick those up. I also want to thank our fabulous media department, who is always so kind and gracious and does a phenomenal job at videotaping these events. And if you haven't visited our website, you can go and check out their high quality work. There's a lot of resources there, so thank you very much to the media team here at Middlesex. And I also wanted to acknowledge we have state partners, the Department of Ed. David McNair is with us, and I know some of the high school folks were also able to join us. So we're really excited that you're here, and thank you for coming and supporting this mission of improving teaching and learning. We are on a little bit of a tight schedule, so we are going to move into lunch. Lunch was scheduled until 12:30. The sessions will start at 12:45, so you have a little less than an hour. You got about 50 minutes to eat and get where you need to go. It's only about a 5-minute walk, but as I said before, you're going to want to go to the session you want to go to, so make sure you get there early. And if you don't get into the session, I think it should be fine. Hopefully we'll all evenly disperse, but if for some reason one of them is the one everybody wants to be at, please just go to another one. There are all good sessions, and we appreciate your flexibility with that. So at this point, we'll have lunch. I'll announce and start kicking you out, once it gets to be about 12:30, 12:35 to start moving you along. But please enjoy. It's right outside, so thank you very much.